Hey, welcome back. This is lesson 2 of our study on unless, talking about Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, Matthew chapter 5, that portion of it. You know, one of the things I like to do when I'm teaching a lesson, particularly in a series like this, is normally to ask my learners, what did you learn from the previous lesson? And so I will ask you that, and I will probably ask, like, did you learn something new, or was something that you already knew kind of reaffirmed there? And so those two questions I really like to ask and see if I can get input and get feedback. And that's a good way to review the previous lesson and help me then to get ready to get into the next lesson. So I would hope that you would say some things like, well, I learned that Jesus taught and preached and healed at the early part of his ministry. I learned that he, at the end of his Sermon on the Mount, challenged his listeners that based on what he taught, that if they kept hearing and doing, they'd be like wise people who built upon a firm foundation. And if they kept hearing but not doing, they'd be like foolish people who built upon sand, temporary things. At the end of each lesson, I'd like to ask, what will a wise person do with the teaching? Or what will a foolish person do with the teaching? So that's just some things that you can think about as you maybe teach your young people or your family as you go through this study. So we're going to keep going. You remember we closed out this part of Matthew chapter 4 going into chapter 5 in lesson 1 where Jesus sat down and his disciples came to him and he opened his mouth and began to teach them. And in chapter 5 verse 3 we start what's called the Beatitudes. Now another thing to do when you're doing Bible study is to look for key words. And a key word would be something that if that word was missing, it would change the meaning of the text. It's that important of a word. One way to identify keywords is to ask what words are repeated. And obviously if you see something repeated several times, it's there for a reason. So let's take a look at Matthew chapter 5 and be thinking about repeated words. I think honestly you would see it pretty quick. In chapter 5 verse 3, Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." You're going to see the word blessed a lot, to be honest with you. The next several verses, blessed are those, as Jesus is going to say. And that's what we call the Beatitudes. The Beatitudes simply mean it's a declaration of blessing, that Jesus is giving this declaration that here's people who are blessed. Jesus has been preaching about the kingdom, repent for the kingdom of heaven is near. And then now he's going to say, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. He's going to talk a lot about the kingdom of heaven. So what we're seeing here in these verses are descriptions of people who are going to be what we might call kingdom dwellers, people that are going to dwell in the kingdom. This is how they behave. Now the word blessed, or blessed, some people will say, is a word that really means a supreme blessing. Supreme happiness, supreme fortunates are people who do these things. Jesus might be saying here, congratulations are in order to these people because you're doing things of which the Father approves. This is really good stuff here. So let's just take a look at this. So the first part of our lesson is going to be looking at these blessed statements, all right? So blessed are the poor in spirit. The word poor, we're pretty obviously understand that. You don't have money, you don't have fame or influence, you don't have honor. You're just lacking what you need to get something done if you're poor. Now, a lot of these folks were probably poor in that sense, but Jesus says, blessed are the poor in spirit. When you add the in spirit part, then you bring in a measure of humility. So really what Jesus is saying is blessed are the humble. Blessed are people who look at themselves and they realize that, hey, when it comes to spiritual things, I'm poor. I don't have anything in me that I can afford to buy heaven or I can buy, God's pleasure. I just lack that. And Jesus says there's a blessing for that. Now, one of the things, we talked about this in the first lesson, about cause and effect relationships. And you see something in the Bible that's causing an effect. So what causes, or we might ask why, what's the reason that people who are poor in spirit are blessed? Well, look at the next answer. It says for, and that's kind of a key word to help us understand this is what it's for. This is the cause of it. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for or because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Okay, so that's excellent. That's great. You know, Jesus was the only one who's really been poor in spirit. I mean, completely poor in spirit. He was completely humble. In fact, Philippians chapter 2, and you can look this related passage up later, but Philippians chapter 2 talks about Jesus humbled himself and became obedient even to the point of death on a cross. And God exalted his name above every name. Every knee's going to bow, every tongue's going to confess that Jesus. And Jesus humbled himself. He was poor in spirit. Nobody else has been poor in spirit as much as Jesus has. All right, so the next verse, verse 4 says, blessed are they that mourn. Okay, now mourn it's a natural thing for me to do, to mourn, to be sad, you know, to grieve. If I have a loved one or a friend that passes away, for example, that's a natural, normal, and good thing. But Jesus is probably talking about more than just when a person dies and we mourn. He's talking about a person who mourns or grieves over sin and just the condition of our world and the sin that's so prominent in the world. You know, it's not natural for me to mourn over sin that I have, or over sin itself. It's natural for me to mourn over people passing away, but not natural for me to mourn over sin. Well, what's the blessing about that? What's such a great, supreme blessing for mourning? Well, Jesus says, because those who mourn are going to be comforted. Look, that idea of comfort is going to be something that occurs right now if I need it, but then permanently, I'll be comforted. I will be comforted for eternity if I know the Lord. And so that is the supreme blessing. All right, so what's the next thing? Well, it's in verse 5, blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Okay, meek, some versions will say gentle. Blessed are the gentle. I used to kind of think that meek rhymed with weak, and so it was really a way of describing weakness. But it's really not. Meekness is strength, but it's a combination of strength and calm. Okay, it's like strength under control. And so if you see a person like a strong man, but he's able to deal gently with people and calmly, and he's got strength under control. That's meekness. Listen, nobody was meek like Jesus. Think about him on the cross and how he said even before the cross, he said, can I not call thousands of angels to come right now? And he could have, but he knew he needed to do his Father's will. And so he held back with what he could have done in his strength. Well, what's so blessed about being strong and under control? Well, blessed are the meek, because they will inherit the earth. You know, the Apostle Peter talked about how there'll be a time where there's coming a new heaven and a new earth wherein dwells righteousness. So look, we want to be where righteousness is. Look, remember Jesus is going to say in a little while that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not going to enter heaven. Well, Peter's talking about how there's coming a time where there's a new heaven and a new earth. Righteousness dwells there. And Jesus said the meek are the ones that are going to inherit that righteous place. So that's a good thing. All right, well, the next verse says this, blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness. Okay, this idea of hungering and thirsting is like a craving. I mean, they are craving righteousness. Things that are righteous are things that are like acts, actions, they're attitudes that God approves of. And so Jesus is saying there's this supreme blessing. There's a supreme happiness. Congratulations to those who have this craving for the acts, the attitudes, the things of which God approves. Now, what's so blessed about that? Well, he says because those people are going to be filled. They're going to be satisfied. Their hunger, their craving for righteousness is going to be filled. Now, that's a blessing. And then he goes on to say this in verse 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Okay, so this supreme blessing for the merciful, those are people who just show mercy. They have compassion upon other people. Look, Jesus said in Luke chapter 6 that we should be merciful like His Father in heaven is merciful. So it's a God thing to be merciful, And then Paul wrote to Titus, and he said, we are not saved by works of righteousness that we have done, but it's by His mercy that we are saved. So our good works of righteousness that we think are good, that God approves of, that doesn't save us. It's God's mercy that saves us. I tell you, Jesus, nobody showed mercy like Jesus. When He hung on the cross and people were insulting Him and, all the severe things they did to Jesus, what did He do? He said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. That's incredible mercy. Jesus did that. Now, the next thing is, blessed are the pure in heart, verse 8. Purity means you're like 100% pure. There's no mixture, nothing's messed up, there's no part this and part that. It's 100% of whatever it is. And so Jesus is saying, blessed are the pure, those who have an unstained, clean heart. Heart's not just the organ in our body, but heart talks about here the center of affection. These are like the things that I do have this strong affection for, the things I like, the things I want. And Jesus is saying, blessed are the pure in heart, those who have 100% clean, unstained affections or desires. Okay, now why is it such a blessing? Blessed are the pure in heart. Well, it says this, because they shall see God. I mean, you're going to get to see God. You're going to get to see God who created everything, who continues to sustain everything, the perfect God. We're going to get to see and comprehend Him in all His glory. That is a tremendous blessing. It's hard for me to grasp it. I don't know how great that's going to be. But Jesus is saying that it's a supreme blessing to those who have that purity in heart. Look, nobody had a heart pure like Jesus did. Nobody. Nobody did that except Jesus. Now, He's going to go on to say this in the next verse, blessed are the peacemakers, because they're going to be called children of God. Okay, so peacemakers, those are folks that obviously are where peace needs to be made. It's where somebody's in a conflict or there's trouble, but they're willing to speak the truth regardless of which way the truth falls, but they're able to declare what God says needs to be done in a given situation. They're peacemakers. What's so blessed about that? Well, those who are peacemakers are going to be called children of God. They're going to be called sons of God. The other day I was in the car and my wife was sitting beside me and she looked at me and she started laughing. And I just kind of looked at her and said, what are you laughing about? And she said, well, when you looked at me just then, you looked just like your dad. Well, it's kind of a neat thing, Sometimes people look at us and say, you're acting like your mother or you look like your dad. Well, when we do what is peaceful and making peace, well, we're doing what our Father would do. We're doing what God would do. And so people see us acting like that. We identify ourselves as children of God. God, you may remember, when Jesus was born, what was the message to the shepherds? Peace on earth and goodwill toward men. So God has been about making peace. In fact, the Bible talks about that, about Him making peace for us. He reconciled us to God in the book of 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And then the last thing here in this particular section is verse 10, blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So blessed are those who are persecuted. The word persecuted really means to chase away or to drive someone out. And Jesus is saying, blessed are the persecuted. It seems like the wording that Jesus used, or the way Matthew records it, is that Jesus was probably referring to ongoing persecution, that these people were being persecuted right now. And Jesus says, blessed are those who are being persecuted. Now, it's not just being persecuted, persecuted for no reason. It's persecuted for righteousness' sake. Okay, remember righteousness, the acts and actions that approve God. Okay, sometimes we do those things that approve God, but man, people don't like it. I mean, we see that. I'm thinking about our teaching our young people. We talk about peer pressure, for example. Look, there are times where we may decide that we want to please God, but the peers we've got, they don't like it. Well, Jesus said, look, if they persecuted me, they're going to persecute you also. He said that in John 15. That's just something we can know. Well, what's the blessing of being persecuted because we're doing the right thing? I mean, nobody wants that. That's the natural thing, is to not want to be driven out, persecuted in any way. But there's a blessing for it. And Jesus says, because theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The cause and effect for these things usually appears in the second part of the verse. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then remember this one we just looked at? Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Verse 3 and verse 10 both include a repeated thought. Theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That kind of makes what we might call bookends to what Jesus is talking about here from verses 3 to 10, that everything in there is talking about really the kingdom of heaven. So those who are in the kingdom of heaven, they're poor in spirit. Those who dwell in it, they mourn, they're meek, they hunger and thirst after righteousness, they're merciful, they're pure in heart, they're peacemakers, and they're willing to be persecuted. And what's so blessed about that? Well, the Bible, Jesus talks about those things, the good things that come. All right, so notice again that only Jesus has ever really done all of those things. When you get the material, the written material, look at that and notice there are going to be a lot of related passages that take you to other places in the Bible that talk about how Jesus was poor in spirit and so forth. So really don't miss that, because that's going to be so important to this whole theme of unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees. See, only Jesus has done that kind of righteousness. And we're going to talk about that in the third lesson. Okay, well, the second part of this lesson, I know if you look at verse 11 of Matthew 5, you know, it continues the idea of blessed. Blessed are you when men revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. So why did we not include verse 11 in part 1? Well, you'll notice there is a little bit of difference. Verses 3 to 10, blessed are the poor in spirit, or blessed are those. It's really talking about those. Blessed are those people. But in verse 11, it changes to blessed are you. It's a plural word, blessed are ye or you, when you face these types of persecution. So it seems like Jesus may be saying we're kind of all in this together. Blessed are you as a group when you face, reviling or insults. That's just a way of saying people are trying to disgrace you by what they say and insult you. And Jesus says there's a blessing when that happens. Blessed are you when you are persecuted. Same thing we just talked about in verse 10, when folks are trying to drive us out. I think if you look really in the world today, I know in other countries, but look, even here in the United States, there are folks that want to drive out any influence of Christian thought. Any influence that we as believers might want to have, they really would prefer to drive that away. And I don't want that. That's not my natural inclination. But Jesus says there's a blessing when people insult you and revile you, and there's a blessing even when people try to drive you out of influence. And blessed are you when people falsely say, so these are lies, but when they falsely say all manners, all kinds of evil against you. Okay, so all kinds of evil means they're talking about just all kinds of things that the evil is like moral wrong. Okay, that you are doing things morally wrong and you don't care who you hurt. That's the idea here. That people are lying, saying that these people who follow Jesus are all about doing what's morally wrong and they don't care who they hurt. That's incredible how people would say that about believers, but Jesus says that that's coming, but it's a blessing when those things happen. What is so blessed about being reviled and insulted and persecuted and having folks lie about you? Well, he goes on to say this in verse 12. Rejoice and be glad. So there's two commands. Rejoice. Rejoice in God's grace. And be glad. Okay, rejoice and be glad. And here's why. Here's the cause and effect. For great is your reward in heaven. There's a reward for you in heaven if you've been persecuted. And that's how they persecuted, for so they persecuted the prophets which were before you. So Jesus is saying the supreme blessing of all this persecution is the fact that there's a great reward for you in heaven, and that's how they persecuted the prophets. You know, the book of Hebrews, the 12th chapter, talks about, chapter 11, excuse me, talks about how there's many people of faith, Old Testament people of faith, Noah and Sarah and Abraham, and just on it goes with these great heroes of the faith. They did many, incredible things, but they're recognized for the faith they had. Well, I'm probably never going to build an ark and save the world. I'm probably never going to part, the Red Sea, for example, but I can have faith. And I can be like those Old Testament saints. Well, the end of Hebrews 11, you need to look at that. It describes all the things the prophets went through. I mean, it talks about that, how they lived in holes in the ground, they faced all kinds of persecution. And yet the promises that God had made to them, they didn't quite receive those promises at that time because God had something better for them that included us. I mean, Jesus has this idea here of this blessing between the prophets of the Old Testament, the persecution they went through, the persecution that He'll go through, and us. There's like a line there of that we're joining in this great line of believers being persecuted. Well, the last thing he says here in this section that we're going to look at begins in verse 13. He says this. Again, he kind of changes languages. First it was blessed are those, then it was blessed are you when persecuted. Now you are. There's an emphasis upon you are. Okay, so Jesus is telling us here that you are the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Now, the world is corrupt. It needs healing. One of the things that salt does, it can heal. It's arguable. I mean, scientists will tell you we're not sure if it does or not, but many people say like putting salt in a wound, I mean, that stings, that hurts, but it can also help the healing process. But salt preserves. That's one of the main things it does. It preserves. It keeps things like, meat back in the old days, you'd put salt around it to keep it preserved for a long time. Okay, so salt preserves, salt adds taste. And Jesus is saying, hey, look, you're the salt of the earth. You're supposed to have a preserving influence upon the corrupt earth. That's basically what he's saying. But he goes on to say this in the passage. He says, but if salt, loses its savor or loses its taste, there's different ways that that's worded. If salt just basically becomes unsalty, then how are you going to make it salty again? The answer is you can't. I mean, it's a rhetorical question. Jesus is saying you can't make unsalty salt salty again. Now, scientists argue, can salt really lose its taste? Well, the word here that's used for this losing its savor, you realize it's actually the word that Jesus used of the foolish man. It's the same word moron. Okay, so a person who is a moron is deficient in his intellect. Salt that loses its saltiness is deficient in some way. Jesus is really talking about something that's defiled. Okay, so if I had a salt shaker, and just imagine something gross. I'll just let you decide that when you lead your young people with this. Just imagine, doing something, spitting in it or pouring some toilet water in or something. I mean, just be gross with it. Okay, well, maybe not every grain of sand has been affected by the filth that's gone in there. But what are you going to do with a salt shaker that has been defiled, has dirt or crud in it? You're not going to be able really to separate the dirt from the salt. You're just going to say, this whole thing is good for nothing. What are you going to do with it? Well, Jesus says it's good for nothing just to be thrown out and let men walk on it. Okay, so that's kind of the idea that we have here, that for a disciple, look, we are to be followers of Christ. We are to be like salt. We're to be and do what Jesus wants us to do. Just like salt is to be and do what salt does, we're to be and do what a believer, a follower of Christ would do, a kingdom dweller would do. And Christ wants us to influence the earth. And so if we become defiled in some way, we're becoming useless to the Lord. I think that's how his listeners would have understood it. He also says you are the light of the world. You know, light, what does that do? Well, it helps things to grow, for one thing. Another thing is it helps you keep from stumbling in the dark. And so a world that is in spiritual darkness needs a light to help it grow spiritually and help it not stumble in the dark. And Jesus gives a couple of illustrations here. He says, like, a city on a hill cannot be hidden. You know, that could be a hill or a mountain, but a city, you just can't hide it because the lights are going to shine. And then people don't light a candle and put it under a basket or a bushel of some kind where the light is hidden, but they put it on a lampstand. And it gives light to everybody in the house, so they benefit from it. They can do things, they can keep from stumbling. Okay, so Jesus, you know, why do we need to be like cities on a hill? Why do we need to be like candles on a lampstand? Well, verse 16 says this: let your light, this is a commandment, let your light so shine. Let it shine like that. Let it shine like a candle on a lampstand. Let it shine like a city on a hill. So that, two things. One is people see your good works. Okay, you want people to see your good works, not for personal gain. Jesus is going to talk about that in Matthew 6. He's going to say, don't do your works of righteousness before men to be seen by them. So don't do these good works to be seen by them for your own glory. But the last part of verse 16 says, you know, let your light so shine before men so that they see your good works, so that you may glorify your Father in heaven. I know that verse meant a lot to me when I was a young person. I was challenged to memorize that verse, and I thought about that. That's how I want to be. I want to be able to show people in my community, in my school, that I can be a fun, you know, good person, letting the light shine of goodness and giving glory to my Father in heaven. And look, that's a quick run through all those verses. That's a lot of verses. You've got some writing, you know, written material that can help you a little bit more in teaching your students, your family. Let me encourage you to do that. But remember to think about this question. At the end of the sermon, Jesus is going to say, he who keeps hearing and keeps doing is like a wise man. What's a wise person going to do with these verses we just looked at? A person who hears these but doesn't do is like a foolish person, building his house upon the sand. Okay, what's a fool going to do with these teachings of Jesus? My prayer is that we do the wise thing. And I hope this has been helpful to you. I look forward to seeing you in our third lesson.